We picked a few of the main approaches to dieting. Those are restriction of calories, so you just eat less. Restriction of some type of food, so if you're restricting carbs versus you're restricting fat or whatever it might be. And then restricting time, so you're only eating at a certain amount of time. Those three things are what people often try to do. They'll pick one of those things and then try to do that as their diet. The problem when you look into the research, though, is you can find that it's good and bad in all the data you look at. It is not anywhere near consistent. And really what it comes down to is just humans are the worst. And what I mean by that is when we try to do nutritional studies and you try to control for what people are doing day to day, and you can randomize people into different groups, like someone who's doing a low carb versus a low fat diet. And you randomize them and you can supply them with the food, and the problem is most people aren't actually going to follow what you tell them to do, and all these other types of influences come into play, like how are they sleeping? Are they exercising? Are they drinking alcohol? Are they smoking cigarettes? All these things that would influence what you're studying, and so that's why we kind of see everything in nutritional research being so messy. But one area that we do know a lot about is overconsumption and how consuming too many calories or too much energy intake and the role that that plays in developing metabolic disease, diabetes, obesity, and a variety of other chronic diseases. So we do know there's this overconsumption, but we could sit and debate all day long on, is it the overconsumption of sugar? Is it the overconsumption of fats? The reality is we don't know that. And if anyone ever approaches you saying that they know the right diet and they know the right approach, that should be your first red flag, because again, the reality is we don't have those answers. But again, what we do know is there's this issue with overconsumption. So whenever I give nutrition or dietary advice, it's mainly addressing how can you figure out a diet that works for you to where you're not going to be over-consuming calories. And so we're going to spend a little time talking about like what is this energy model of nutrition. So you probably heard people say like calories in, calories out. That's a heavily debated area in nutritional research as well, because people are like, it's not that simple. We're going to talk about why it really isn't that simple, but yet again, it is in a way. So we're going to talk about this energy in, energy out model of nutrition, and then how can you figure out what your correct diet approach is. That's what we're going to spend today doing. So again, nutritional science, humans are the worst. Research is all over the place. I should have changed the slide before I started talking about all this stuff, but this figure here on the right-hand side is monitoring the food production from some of these large organizations, including the USDA. So how much food are we producing? We talked a while back on the production of food was to really address, how can we make enough food to where people aren't going to starve? How can we make it cheap for people to be able to afford? How can we make it so that it can stay on the shelves and doesn't expire? And all these things were addressed really well, but what we ended up with is just this mass production of food. And that food availability has been in line with this increase in obesity. And it makes sense because there's an environmental influence to what you're eating. It's so easy right now to have a bunch of cookies and cake and so on, whereas back when you used to have to go to the bakery to get these things. It was more difficult to go out of your way to consume these non-nutrient dense foods, but very calorie dense foods. So lots of calories in them, but they're not very nutritious. So that food's more available to us now, and we tend to over-consume it. And so these figures are just kind of graphing carbs, fats, and proteins. Now the food supply has actually maintained relatively consistent in terms of the production of fats, carbs, and proteins. But our consumption of fats and carbohydrates specifically in the US has increased, and proteins kind of stayed the same. We haven't really done anything with protein, but fats and carbohydrates have both increased. And And that's what these trends really are here. So this energy in, energy out model, again, it's super complex. This is actually from a review paper that was published in 2022 where the authors were just kind of reviewing where we're at with the research, and people get into these debates of there's a glucose and insulin model of obesity, there's the calorie or energy intake model of obesity, and there's really just this back and forth war of like, I know why people get obesity, no, I know why people get obesity. And again, it's so complex. There's not just this simple answer because even your brain comes into play. So there's studies where people assess individuals with obesity, and they tend to have higher reward pathways associated with food. So having that increased reward when you're eating something not as nutritious and so on, which again leads to overconsumption. It all comes back to the overconsumption. When you're increasing calories, not everyone's metabolism is the same. So there's a lot of hormones that come into play. The big ones we think of, insulin, even your thyroid hormone, a hormone called leptin that tells us if we're full or not. These things are different for everyone, and so it changes how you break down foods. And so your energy intake is influenced by a variety of things, such as reward pathway or your environment socially. You know, when you go to any sort of like work-related event or social event, always tends to be revolved around food, you know, very rarely. And I intentionally don't bring food in here because I mean, I don't think it needs to, you know, these community gatherings don't necessarily need to revolve around some sort of food. But oftentimes we see that, and it makes it really easy for us to, you know, we're at this event, it's easy for us to overconsume foods. And so this is just really to highlight this complexity of energy intake, but also energy output. So everyone's hormones are completely different. And when we talk about energy out specifically, a lot of people, we're gonna do this dance later to try to burn some extra calories. No. Now, a lot of people think of like energy out as just exercise, right? We have what's called our total daily energy expenditure. It's made up from 4 different pillars of burning energy. One of those being your basal metabolic rate. That's majority of how many calories you burn day to day. And that has to do a lot with how much muscle mass you have. So having higher muscle mass, you're more metabolically active. That basal metabolic rate increases, so you're burning more calories at rest. That's why, for those of you that have worked with here at the gym, I always preach, you know, increase resistance training or strength training because you're building muscle, and that allows you to burn more calories, and so that basal metabolic rate is going to increase. It's not so much about what you're doing during exercise itself. That only makes up a fraction of what you're burning day to day. So people spend so much time on like, oh, I'm going to try to outrun a bad diet by hopping on a treadmill for an hour. And although there are ways to outrun a bad diet, it's just not the correct way to think about it. Again, exercise, it only makes up a small fraction of your daily calorie expenditure. People that are very active can burn about 15 to 30% of their calories during activity. That is like an extremely active individual who's exercising for a very long period of time. So it definitely has an influence. I don't want you to think that exercise doesn't matter in terms of energy expenditure, but it's just one of the components. A couple other things that make an impact, one being the thermic effect of food. And the thermic effect is essentially when you take in nutrients, your body doesn't just automatically get the energy that's within the nutrients that you're taking in. Your body has to break down certain components of it and make it accessible for the rest of your organs. And that process actually utilizes energy. You use energy to break down your energy. That's this thermic effect of food. As it turns out, protein has a very high thermic effect, meaning that just taking in protein burns more calories overall throughout your day. So having higher protein intake raises this total daily energy expenditure. So what should you do within this information? Really understanding that the nutrition world is so crazy. I caution you to try to find this diet that people are doing that you think is the right way to eat. What you want to do is try to figure out, how does your diet look when you feel healthy, when you feel good? Like, you don't have to know the research to know what kinds of foods make you feel better day to day and what kinds of foods make you feel worse. But the foods that make you feel worse in one way, maybe there's such a reward to them. We're like, I love having that cookie when I get home on Friday and things like that. I don't want you to get rid of anything that you really enjoy doing. How can you fit those things that you know might not be necessarily super healthy? How can you still fit them in your diet, but not overconsume? Because again, that's where all these problems come in, is the overconsumption. And I'm generalizing here in terms of a majority of the issues with nutrition. When we're talking, there are people who have an issue with consuming enough food to begin with. That's a completely separate discussion. Today we're focusing on the issues with overconsumption. So it's totally going to be individual, and we'll talk a little bit more about approaches to this, but adherence is the most important thing. If you start any diet, if your neighbor tells you, like, I just started the carnivore diet, all I do is eat animal products, stuff like that, it's becoming really trendy right now, and you try it and you're like, oh, they did so well, I just got to stick with it, but it's really hard for you, you got to stop it. You can't just do a diet that you can't sustain. It's going to end up being so much harder on your body when you're fluctuating over and over and over. So if you find yourself often starting a diet and then failing and then starting a diet and then failing and starting again, it's time to zoom out and change that approach that you're taking. Do something that is simple enough to where you can sustain it. You don't have to think about this energy in, energy out as a day-to-day thing. Some days are going to be worse than others. We go on vacation, we go to family events and holidays. We're going to overconsume on certain days. But the rest of the week, you can be really intentional about, making sure you're healthy. These days are coming, and you don't have to feel bad about yourself for failing on these days. So what tends to work the best as far as adherence goes is called flexible dieting. Flexible dieting is shifting your focus away from restricting those types of foods and following these trendy diets that you see online where the media says, like, this is the new way to eat, and the documentaries are all about those types of diets and such. But flexible dieting it's flexible to your lifestyle, your environment. What foods do you enjoy eating that are healthy? What foods keep you from over consuming or snacking so much? And just really focus on the amount of calories you're taking in overall. And you don't have to worry as much about the fats and carbs. Protein, I'm going to convince you why you still want to worry about that. But it's just much more flexible, literally. And this comes from a group of research showing that the more rigid a diet is, or the more restricted a diet is, the more likely it's going to induce eating disorders, mood dysregulation, anxiety, and also just simply failing that diet. So it baffles me how extreme some of these diets are that people preach as being the right way to eat, because it's having so many different adverse effects that are not helpful for you. I should mention too, flexible dieting is not for everyone, because some people really just don't like to pay attention to how many calories they're taking in, and maybe this flexible dieting causes them to eat more processed foods and eat more of these non-nutrient dense foods but high calorie dense foods that cause you to keep eating. They don't fill you up, and so you keep on eating these things like fast food and sugary soft drinks and such that don't fill you up. It's just empty calories, essentially. It works well for some people to actually cut those things out completely and restrict them. And in flexible dieting, you don't really necessarily have to focus on that. So I bring that up because it's definitely not for everyone. Some people do like that restriction approach, but I just want you to know that that is not the way for most people. So when we're talking macronutrients specifically, we're talking protein, carbs, and fats. The problem with people who go on diets and restrict calories, people tend to go, I call them health kicks. They last 2 to 4 weeks in most people, and you dive in and you go to the grocery store, buy a whole new pantry full of food because you're ready to start this health kick. You're ready to change your nutrition completely. And people tend to over-exaggerate it. They restrict calories so much. And when you restrict calories, protein tends to fall with it. When you're going on any sort of diet, don't mess with the protein. Keep it at an absolute number that won't change. You can mess around with carbs and fats and such and see what's easiest for you, but that protein should stay at a pretty consistent number. The very minimum amount of protein in what we talk about in medical school is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. That is really, really, really low, and it's right on the border of what induces what's called a catabolic state, or breaking down muscle. And you'd never want to be in a position like that. So it is a good idea to shoot for much higher than that 0.8. A lot of recent position stands where they're called meta-analyses. The nutrition industry will kind of group all the research together and see where we're at as far as recommendations for people. It seems to be right around this 1.4 to 1.7 grams per kilogram is a really good target to hit. Kilogram is your body weight in pounds divided by 2.2 if you wanted to calculate that. So much higher than the 0.8 that is often preached in a clinical setting. I recommend shooting a little bit higher than that. This figure here actually in the middle is from a study where they had people, they were restricted in calorie intake but had high protein or high carbohydrate. And so basically they just substituted protein for carbohydrate in different groups, and found that the people who had the protein substituted for carbohydrate lost significantly more fat and maintained lean body mass, which you want to maintain lean body mass at all costs, or as much as you can, because it provides so many more health benefits than just helping you move. So increasing protein intake had that effect in increasing fat loss, sustaining muscle. This study over here, you got a question?
Yeah, I do.
It's actually a really, really good question. When you look at the composition of protein, plant-based protein is less sufficient in what are called essential amino acids. So protein's made up of 20 different amino acids, 9 of those being what we call essential, meaning your body actually can't make them on its own. They need to come from your diet. Plants have those essential amino acids, but they're at a much lower concentration. And in addition to that, when you're taking in plant-based protein, it's bound up in a lot of fibrous material, so your body absorbs a percentage less versus animal-based protein. So like animal-based protein, you're getting more of those essential amino acids and it's easier to absorb. So plant-based protein, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it, but you tend to actually have to increase overall. And a lot of the research suggests that you blend different types of protein. So most of the ability to get to where you would be on an animal-based diet is to have like wheat, pea, and corn protein blended together in like powder form, because then you can absorb it easier. But yeah, that's a great question, and that's a really heavily studied area of research. This figure over here is from a satiety study where they just took 38 different foods and gave them to individuals and measured how full they felt over the course of a couple hours. And the protein-rich foods induced more satiety. You felt more full and you're not eating as much. And remember, it also has that increased thermic effect, meaning you're actually burning more calories when you take in protein in general. Plus you feel more full. What was so interesting to me though, the most satiety-inducing food, which basically, again, satiety being you're full, was a baked potato, across the board. That was just super interesting to me. But again, these trends of higher protein concentrations inducing satiety definitely holds true within the research. And let's see. It changes on my computer, but not on the screen. So in summary, really what I recommend you doing is make sure you're getting sufficient protein. I mean, we know that to provide more benefit than any other aspects of your diet other than reducing alcohol intake. Protein tends to be this area of research that consistently finds positive results as opposed to changing the carb to fat ratios. And then if your goal is to prevent diseases like cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, diabetes, obesity, and such, you want to avoid overconsumption. Increasing protein is going to help with that. I didn't mention when I talked about the other macronutrients actually. As far as carbohydrates go, it can be broken into sugars, starches, and fiber, which is contained in a lot of different vegetables and fruits. Fiber has a high satiety index and also increases that thermic effect as well, so increases calorie intake. So fiber and protein both seem to be really important for that. Now, added sugars have the opposite effect. When you're taking in liquid sugar substituted drinks, that tends to be the most difficult thing for people in terms of when you take in sugary drinks, you're not getting full at all. Those calories raise glucose levels quite a bit, and it's definitely not healthy when it's overconsumed. Totally fine to have this added sugar as long as you're not over-consuming. There doesn't seem to be this independent effect in terms of like sugar is causing these issues. It's when sugar is over-consumed that you have the issues, so don't just cut stuff out of your diet because you think it's having this independent influence. It's just when you do over-consume, that's when the problems start to arise. And then fats, they're broken into saturated and unsaturated. Saturated fats are the fats that are solid at room temperature. These are like animal fats, butter, but it's also in like coconut oils. And then the unsaturated fats come from nuts and a lot of the oils that you put in your foods and omega-3 supplements that a lot of people take, like fish oil. That's a polyunsaturated fat. So there's lots of different types of fats. Saturated fats within the research tend to be more associated with cardiovascular risks, specifically with cholesterol levels, versus the polyunsaturated fats. Again, this is just like any other area of research where you're going to find people often debating topics like this. But takeaways is don't focus on all the small details of your restricted diet. If you're going to start a diet and it is to prevent any sort of overconsumption, it's totally going to be individualized based on how you feel. Focus on how you feel. Try to figure out what foods fill you up and keep you from snacking throughout the day, because that's a really easy way to add up calories. Protein's going to do that. Fiber's going to do that. And then better than anything you can do related to your diet, we talked about get a good night of sleep and go exercise. Metabolically, if you're trying to prevent these diseases, those are going to play so much more of a role in preventing them than anything with your diet's going to do.